Today we're on lecture number 4, and what we will be discussing today will be Ukraine's rapidly evolving national identity as a consequence of Russian military aggression since 2014, but especially 2022. We need to firstly look at some kind of context, background to this. And here we should look at the second slide. One of the factors here is that this divergence between Ukrainian and Russian identity, this divergence between both countries, didn't just begin when Russia launched its first invasion in 2014. That obviously accelerated the divergence, unlike what Putin, when he launched that, expected. He expected Ukraine to come back. But this divergence between Ukrainian and Russian identities was already there when the Soviet Union disintegrated in 1991, and it's grown in an evolutionary fashion between 1991 and 2013. So for over 2 decades, Ukraine has been building a Ukrainian identity different to Russian. Of course, there's been domestic competition, even violence with in the Euromaidan revolution between pro-Ukrainian and pro-Russian forces, but nevertheless, that evolution and strengthening of Ukrainian identity was inevitable over that period of time, and that continued irrespective of the fact you had only one pro-Russian president, Viktor Yanukovych. And one of the ways that Ukraine and Russia was different during this period of time is that Ukraine experienced 3 revolutions, 3 popular revolutions, and these were galvanizers, mobilizers, changing Ukrainian identity, crystallizing, speeding up the formation of Ukrainian identity. Firstly, right on the eve of the USSR disintegrating, the so-called Granite Revolution, primarily young people, but having a tremendous impact on the kind of stagnation and decline and ultimately collapse and the banning of the Ukrainian Communist Party. The Orange Revolution in 2004, a major revolution with Viktor Yushchenko as the leader of the opposition. This, you could argue, brought Ukraine onto the European map. It showed Ukrainians were different to Russians. I think there were many people, particularly in continental Western Europe, who until then kind of lumped Ukrainians and Russians together as being very close, and that you couldn't really relate to Ukrainians separate to Russians. This was an ongoing, I think, issue with the European Union, not really relating to Ukraine differently to Russia. And then a decade after that, the Euromaidan Revolution of Dignity, which was unlike the Orange Revolution and the Granite Revolution. It was violent because of the kind of person who was running Ukraine, a thuggish criminal, Viktor Yanukovych, unlike Leonid Kravchuk in the Granite Revolution and Leonid Kuchma in the Orange Revolution. The other factors in Ukraine are extremists were always very weak, again, which meant that the democratic forces, centre-left or centre-right, centrists, were always the dominant forces. The extreme right in Ukraine, despite all the stereotypes about Ukraine, were always very weak. They only on one occasion entered the Ukrainian parliament in 2012, when Svoboda, the Freedom Party, received 10% of the vote. The Communist Party was popular after it was re-legalized in 1992, but it went into decline during the Orange Revolution and since then. So the communists were kind of eclipsed in eastern Ukraine and the Crimea by the Party of Regions. Russia was totally different during these 2 decades, totally different. There was no real mass popular front in the Gorbachev period in the late 1980s, unlike Ruch in Ukraine. Nationalism was always a very dominant force in Russia, both left-wing extremist Soviet nationalism and far-right neo-Nazi fascist nationalism and kind of orthodox imperial nationalism, this kind of union of the left and right, always far stronger than democratic forces in Russia. You didn't have any popular kind of democratic revolutions. You actually had 2 hardline attempted coups d'etats, both in August 1991 and in the autumn of 1993. So in contrast to Ukraine, where you had 3 popular democratic revolutions, in Russia you had hardline extremist attempted coups d'etats. These brown, red, white forces, pro-Soviet, pro-Tsarist, fascist, neo-Nazi forces who were aligned together, became marginalized a bit after the 1993 failed coup d'etat, but they became mainstream eventually under Putin. And it's those mainstream forces who are coloring the rhetoric of Putin and his Kremlin gang of war criminals. And it's those who are solidly behind the military aggression and genocidal warfare against Ukraine. During Putin's rule, which is now practically 25 years, nearly a quarter of a century, we've had the evolution of authoritarianism into a dictatorship. The opposition is crushed, the independent media is crushed, a million Russians have fled abroad, civil society is stagnant. And so on the eve of Russian military aggression in 2014, 2022, we have 2 very different countries. We have a country where Ukrainians are citizens, where they feel they have agency, where they have crystallized and developed an identity different to Russians, and Russia, a country of subjects and slaves, where they do not feel they have any agency, any ability to influence anything. They still are, like in the old Tsarist days, appealing to the Tsar always to resolve problems, as opposed to themselves taking action. A country which is supportive of military aggression against Ukraine, xenophobically anti-Western, and where imperialism is the game in town, the only game in town. If we look at slide 3, this is found what we've just been talking about, this divergent transitions between Ukraine and Russia, can be seen in the differences between both countries. With Ukraine undertaking what could be called a post-colonial transition, a strong affirmative action for previously Russified Ukrainian language and culture, whereas in Belarus, a pro-Soviet leader takes power in 1994, Alexander Lukashenko creates a dictatorship and a massive political repression. In Russia, similarly, you move towards a dictatorship as well, and this is built on an identity which sees itself as a successor to the Soviet Union. Putin has repeatedly said that Russia is historic. Russia is the equivalent of the Soviet Union, and Russia is not a nation state, it's a civilization without borders, i.e. a country which seeks imperialism and seeks expansionism and military aggression. If we go to the next slide now, we have again a very different approach to the past. Russia has never dealt with difficulties in the past, with crimes, with problem areas of history. It's never denounced Soviet communism, totalitarianism, mass murder, mass crimes in the Soviet Union, especially during Joseph Stalin's rule of the Soviet Union. Ukraine, in contrast, has followed the European path, where many resolutions by different structures, the European Parliament, Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, Council of Europe, have adopted resolutions which have condemned Soviet communism and Nazism as equally monstrous, as equally totalitarian ideologies, equally criminal ideologies, have condemned the crimes committed by both ideologies, and have called for the denouncing of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of 1939, which assigned Western Ukraine, Western Belarus, 3 Baltic states to the Soviet Union. Of course, this is an area of history which is ignored in Russia's use of the Great Patriotic War, because that begins in 1941, ignoring the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact or excusing it. So those kinds of crimes have been opened up, discussed, condemned. The archives have been opened. There's been decommunization, desovietization, DeStalinization in Ukraine. None of these areas have been undertaken in Putin's Russia. And so that Europeanization of Ukrainian identity has been different to Russian, has taken place, whereas in Russia, the opposite has taken place. You've had a doubling down of Soviet and imperial identity under Putin. Russia and Ukraine, therefore, already on the eve of these military aggression in 2014 and especially 2022, had become very different countries. Russia never could accept that. Russia always approached Ukraine as a budding potential second Belarus, resembling a country run or a satellite state run by Alexander Lukashenko. But that kind of support for transforming Ukraine into a pro-Russian puppet state or satellite state never existed in Ukraine. It didn't have widespread support, except to a little bit in the Donbass and Crimea, but never majority and never nationwide support. And therefore, Russia's understanding or feeling of how Ukraine should look, how Ukraine should develop, was simply incompatible with the realities on the ground. And this is why Russia, or one of the major reasons why Russia was so surprised and so stunned, and still to this day cannot accept Ukrainian resistance, Ukrainian resilience against its full-scale military aggression, and why it continues to lie to itself that, oh, it's just a small group of Nazis running the country, but the majority of Ukrainians want to be with us. I mean, it's simply untrue, especially today. But this is the mythology that they continue to delude themselves with. In Ukraine, that's not the case. And this separation of Ukrainians and Russians, separation of two identities, two peoples, two states, was already evident by 2013, and since 2014 has grown even more. And that, I think, is important to understand the context, because this anti-Russianism, which has been growing in Ukraine since 2014, didn't come from nowhere. It was already strongly developed in a separate Ukrainian identity. One of the ways to look at this is by seeing in Ukraine that there was a kind of a competition between two forms of identity. On the right, you have what could be called Pan-Slavic, Eastern Slavic, pro-Russian, Pan-Russian identity. so an identity which looked at Ukraine in the same way as Lukashenko looks at Belarus, a kind of a younger brother, puppet state of Russia. And then you have on the left-hand side a Ukrainian identity separate to Russian, where it's a completely different approach. A country which decides for itself where it wants to go in the foreign policy field, a country where the Ukrainian language is the only state language, not Ukrainian and Russian, as in Belarus, where Ukrainian history is treated as a history of Ukrainian people separate to Russian, not a history of the three Eastern Slavs together. And a country where, for example, the Russian Orthodox Church is not the dominant church. The dominant church, as in every normal Orthodox country, the dominant church is the Ukrainian Church, the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. Every country with an Orthodox religion is a country where it has one autocephalous independent Orthodox Church which represents that country. In the Russian case, no, the Russian Orthodox Church should dominate both Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. So very different approaches, and there was in particular intense competition with the rise of the Party of Regions during the Orange Revolution, Party of Regions being based on the Donetsk organized criminal clan. And so the period between the Orange Revolution and the Euromaidan Revolution, 2004-2014, was the most intense, and in terms of political competition, it came to violence in the Euromaidan Revolution, but the Party of Regions disintegrated in February 2014, and the Communist Party was then banned for not agreeing to take off its election material and its propaganda material, symbols of the communist regime, which were banned, and therefore pro-Russian forces became marginalized after 2014. This led to the domination of Ukraine by the left-hand column, a pro-Ukrainian identity, with very little pushback from pro-Russian Eastern Slavic identity, which had become marginalized and which became increasingly marginalized, especially after the 2022 full-scale invasion. In Ukraine and Russia, one of the ways, again, to see to what degree they had diverged completely prior to Russia's full-scale invasion, and one of the reasons why Russia was, or Putin's Russia was so angry about developments in Ukraine, was that you had DeStalinization in Ukraine and reStalinization in Russia. So very completely contrasting approaches to the most criminal period of Soviet history. In Ukraine, you had already from the mid to late 1980s the demands of dissidents, writers, cultural elites, even some national communists for denouncing the Stalin period, denouncing him for the Holodomor, 1933 artificial famine, which killed 4 to 5 million Ukrainians, or murdered 4 to 5 million Ukrainians. You had demands to open up archives and condemn the murder of Ukrainian cultural intellectual elites. In the 1930s, the imprisonment of dissidents and writers in the 60s, and especially in the 1972 crackdown, which was called a pogrom by Ukrainian dissidents. All of this began at that period of time in the kind of late Gorbachev period and never stopped, even under Yanukovych, because academics and writers and journalists continued to promote this de-Stalinization and condemnation of Soviet crimes against Ukrainians. In the case of Russia, the opposite happened. Firstly, many of the Russian emigres going back to the 20s and 30s were admirers of Stalin. They saw him as a kindred spirit, a kindred nationalist. Stalin was an imperialist, they were imperialists. And so Russian emigre Eurasianism was very close and similar to the national Bolshevism promoted by Stalin, of course, in the case of the white Russian emigres, without the Bolshevik component. But nevertheless, the same kind of concept, and that concept of Eurasian civilization, of Russia at the center of a Eurasian civilization, which is unique and superior to the West, came from these Russian emigres and had its roots in Stalinist and Russian traditional messianism. The period of de-Stalinization in Russia was very short, late 1980s, first half of the 1990s, and then it ended. From the 1990s, already before Putin formally came to power, Russia was lurching to the right in foreign policy and memory politics. And under Putin, you've had de facto the re-Sovietization of Russia and the re-Stalinization of Russia, with Stalin promoted as a hero because he defeated the Nazis, he built a new empire and transformed the USSR into a nuclear superpower, which was respected as an equal by the United States. This is all sort of something that really excites Russian nationalists, and the glorification of Stalin is linked at the same time to the celebration of the Great Patriotic War as a new religion, and the Great Patriotic War is celebrated as a military victory, as opposed to being commemorated for the tragedy of so many people dying. So that changes as well under Putin. And so very different approaches. This changes even more after the Euromaidan revolution, with Ukraine adopting decommunization laws, where it removes all of this kind of pro-Soviet, pro-Russian approaches to World War II, approaches to Stalin, approaches to Soviet history, is all removed from Ukraine, and Ukraine moves in a completely different direction. So Ukraine begins to commemorate World War II, 1939 to 45, as opposed to celebrating military conquest in the Great Patriotic War, 1941 to 45. That is one of the areas which adds to that embitterment and anger by Putin's Russia towards Ukraine. And the Stalin cult in Russia, as we look in the next slide 8, the Stalin's cult in Russia goes off the deep end. I mean, school textbooks are used to promote Stalin. The majority of Russians, including young people, come to see Stalin in a positive way. This cult of Stalin leads to monuments going up to him, leads to denouncing of individuals, civil society groups, and historians who are trying to reveal to the public the crimes of Stalin. So Memorial, a long-term civil society group which was involved in exposing Stalin's crimes going back to the late 1980s, it's been around that long, was banned in 2022, and it's at least one of its leaders was imprisoned in Putin's Russia. So very, very different approaches. Stalin, and for Putin, what's clearly important here is the Stalin period and the Brezhnev era period from the early 1960s to mid-1980s, Stalin, Andropov, and Chernenko eras. These two conservative periods of rule in the Soviet Union are what excites Putin the most. Putin dislikes intensely the other periods of time, 1920s, 1960s in Ukraine, and especially the Gorbachev period. He dislikes those because those are periods of liberalization, reform, and demands from people like the Ukrainians. So Ukrainians and Russians already approach the Soviet Union in very different ways. Ukrainians looking to periods of liberalization, Ukrainianization, kind of condemnation of Soviet and Stalin crimes, and Putin and the current regime in Russia looking more towards the conservative periods of time in the Soviet Union. So very, very different approaches. We can see in the next slide, slide 9, the degree to which Ukrainian and Russian attitudes to Stalin completely diverged. And this process was taking place already prior to 2014, but of course went even greater after 2014. This particular opinion poll was undertaken by the Russian Levada Center and the Ukrainian Kiev International Institute for Sociology. And you can see that the orange line is Russian, with growing admiration, growing support for Stalin as a great Soviet leader. And in the case of Ukraine, the blue line, that's going into decline. And so far more and more Russians are looking to Stalin in a positive way, and more Ukrainians are looking at Stalin as a criminal, as a tyrant, as it were. So again, complete divergence. What changes in 2014 in Ukraine is that revolutionary reformers come to power, and these reformers were far more successful than the reformers of the Orange Coalition that came to power with Viktor Yushchenko in 2004, where much of the popularity of the Orange Revolution was squandered by infighting between Yulia Tymoshenko and Viktor Yushchenko. This was not the case after 2014. After 2014, under President Petro Poroshenko and Prime Minister Arseniy Yatsenyuk, Ukraine moved ahead in reform in a whole variety of areas: economic, social, decentralization of the country, in terms of new legislation on corruption, creation of anti-corruption organizations and bodies, and in the area of memory politics, the adoption of 4 very important laws, which were dubbed the Decommunization laws. These laws we've already talked about. They looked at Soviet history in a very different way. No longer was Ukraine celebrating the Great Patriotic War. It was commemorating Ukraine in World War II. Nazi and Soviet symbols were banned, both of them. Nazi and Soviet monuments, plaques were taken down. Streets were renamed away from their communist names. So Dnipropetrovsk became the city of Dnipro, for example. But one of the biggest and well-known steps was nicknamed Leninopad, the falling down of Lenin monuments. And this had already been taking place in Western Central Ukraine since the 1990s, but it spread to the majority of Central Ukraine and especially Eastern and Southern Ukraine after 2014. And 2 of the biggest monuments would have been which were taken down were in Kharkiv and then Dnipropetrovsk. In the case of the pro-Russian separatist regions, the so-called Donetsk People's Republic, Luhansk People's Republic, which were propped up by Moscow, there you had the flowering of a Stalin cult, just as you had in Russia. So complete contrast between the two.
A large crowd gathered in the eastern Ukrainian city of Kharkiv on Sunday.
Kharkiv had a huge monument to Lenin in the biggest square in Europe, and this monument was brought down in September of 2014. When the Azov battalion had been, after the Azov battalion had been fighting and liberated Mariupol from pro-Russian separatists, and the Azov battalion its origins were actually in Kharkiv, amongst civil society activists, nationalists, and football supporters. The changes in Ukrainian identity after 2014, again after 2022, which we'll talk about soon, but after 2014 were revolutionary. If we talk about the changes up until then being evolutionary from the late 1980s to 2013, here we're talking about very radical and quick changes. This is not surprising. In every country that's at war, every country where there's bloodshed, people have died, identities change very quickly. I mean, that's true throughout history, and this is what happens in 2014 and 2022. But key, I think, here is the greater degree of national integration of the country, and Ukrainians, many of whom are Russian speakers in eastern and southern Ukraine, moving closer to Western and Central Ukrainians and moving away from Russians in Russia. This, I think, is probably the most important aspect of this, because Russian military aggression on both occasions, 2014, 2022, had the greatest shock upon precisely Russian speakers in Ukraine. It didn't have that same degree of shock amongst West Ukrainians, because Western Ukrainians never had illusions about Russia. They never believed Soviet propaganda that Russians were brotherly peoples, and so because of that, they didn't see anything unusual in what Russia was doing. But for Russian speakers who had bought into this Soviet propaganda that Ukrainians and Russians are brothers, they're fraternal nations, etc., etc., they had believed that. This came as a massive shock. How could a brother do this to Ukrainians? And so they had to reevaluate their identity far more than West Ukrainians, and that led to them moving far closer in many different ways to West Ukrainians than they had been before. For the first time in the Ukrainian parliament, you had a pro-Ukrainian, pro-European constitutional majority, because pro-Russian forces had disintegrated. The Party of Regions no longer existed. Its successor, the opposition bloc, was very small. Parts of Ukraine were occupied by Russia, and therefore elections couldn't be held there, and those areas which were occupied by Russia would have been the areas which previously would have provided pro-Russian members of parliament. That elections couldn't be held, so that wasn't the case. The Communist Party was banned, as I mentioned, and so even areas such as support for integration into Russian-led Eurasia collapsed during that period of time. The Russian Orthodox Church begins to become less popular. And on the foreign policy domain, you have a majority support for Ukraine joining the European Union and NATO, and eventually that those two goals, become included in the Ukrainian constitution. If you had de-Sovietization, de-Stalinization between, shall we say, 1988 and 2013, and then you had decommunization from 2015 onwards, after Russia's full-scale invasion of 2022, what you have is de-Russification of Ukraine. This is in many ways something undertaken from the ground up. It's not something that President Zelensky is promoting, and this is, I think, very, very key to understand. It's a reaction to it's an angry reaction to what Russia is doing in Ukraine, and the fact that Russian military aggression is impacting the greatest upon, ironically, Russian speakers in eastern and southern Ukraine. So that leads to many monuments which previously were not taken down, such as Tsarina Catherine in Odessa, which remained after 2014 but was taken down in 2023, and other monuments to Russian writers like Pushkin, to Russian generals, street names, monuments, all of these begin to be changed or taken down. A kind of what we have now is a general national Ukrainian hatred of all things Russian. Only less than 5% of Ukrainians after 2022 hold a positive view of Russia and Russians. You have the growth of support for the Ukrainian language, because one area where anybody can protest is by switching from Russian to Ukrainian. Zelensky bans 5 pro-Russian TV channels and 12 pro-Russian political forces, which were not popular, but they were banned, which included 2 successors to the Party of Regions. And the Russian Orthodox Church becomes under criminal investigation, and because of its support for Russian army aggression, Russian military aggression against Ukraine, and its support for Russian occupiers on the ground in some cases. Probably the most well-known monument to be taken down during this time would have been the one of Tsarina Catherine in Odessa. The Russians always looked at this kind of monument and to prove in their eyes that Odessa was a Russian city because it was founded by Catherine. That's of course not true. There was Cossack settlements before that, but the removal of Tsarina was another example of the cleansing of Ukraine from Russian influence. So these ramifications, I think, of different approaches between Russian and Ukrainian memory politics have ramifications, especially in the field of foreign policy. In the case of Russia, you having growing support for the idea that Russia is not a nation state, but a civilization, that Russia lies at the center of a separate Eurasian civilization, which is superior to that of the West. It has no borders, so it can continue expanding when it wants to. It has a sphere of influence, which it demands that the West, and especially the United States, recognizes. In Eurasia, Putin looks to sign with President-elect Donald Trump a new kind of Yalta agreement, where the US would recognize Ukraine and Eurasia as a Russian, as an exclusive Russian sphere of influence, or as when Medvedev was president, he called it the zone of privileged interests of Russia in Eurasia. This would be a very different approach to Ukraine. Russia would demand that Ukraine would be part of the Ruski Mir, the Russian world, with Russia as, of course, the leader, the elder brother, and that Ukraine has no right to choose for itself its own destiny, its own foreign policy. So one of the demands, of course, that Russia is making today is that Ukraine forever renounce NATO membership, and that Ukraine remain a so-called neutral state, which in Russian eyes is very different to a kind of a Western definition of what is neutrality. In the case of Ukraine, its memory politics and its promotion of identity reinforced its differences to Russian and to Russia, and reinforced its drive to rejoin Europe, to become part of Europe, to introduce democratic and European values inside Ukraine, rejection of the idea of Ukraine becoming some kind of Russian puppet state, and so the memory politics which Ukraine especially promoted after 2014 was very important in reinforcing that Europeanization of Ukrainian identity. And the more Ukrainian identity becomes Europeanized, the less, of course, it's going to have any relationship to Russia itself. So you can't really divorce things, such questions as identity, memory politics in Ukraine from foreign policy and from relations with Russia, because these are all interconnected between each other. Let's look now at just 8 myths promoted by Russian propaganda about Ukraine. And the first one, which is evident in countless Russian propaganda, media articles, TV and radio, is that Ukraine is an artificial state, that Ukraine was created in the Soviet Union. There was no Ukraine prior to that, that it's a mixture of territories that includes so-called ancient Russian lands in the east and south. It's a kind of a country which has been hobbled together, as it were. Of course, this has nothing to do with reality as a Ukrainian state, but it has nothing to do with reality in general. Most countries are themselves hobbled together in various ways, and they include often territories which maybe shouldn't be in those territories. And if we started to go through every European country and say, well, that shouldn't be there, that should be over there, there would be complete chaos. And if we start talking and using terms such as, oh, these territories belong here, or these are historical Russian territories, well, then what about areas that Russia's occupied itself, such as Karelia? Should Karelia go back to Finland? Should Kaliningrad go back to Germany or Poland? Should the Kuril Islands go to Japan? Etc., etc. So the idea that somehow only Russia has a claim to sort of these various territories is simply untrue. It's also untrue because researchers and scholars have written about southern and eastern Ukraine, this area that Russia or Putin calls New Russia, to show that right up until the 20th century, from, say, shall we say, the late 18th century, when the area was occupied by the Tsarist army and was included in the Tsarist Empire, the majority of the people living there were Ukrainians, and then there were lots of foreigners. It wasn't just Russians. There were Greeks, Jews, Italians, and others who moved to the area as it was developing. But the majority of the largest ethnic group in southern Ukraine, the area that Putin calls New Russia, were Ukrainians throughout its history. And prior to Russia's occupation and invasion in 1783, you had at least 6 centuries of Crimean Tatar rule, and Crimean Tatar Khanate was part of the Ottoman Empire. So the idea that this is Ukraine's unusual, that Ukraine's an artificial state, that Ukraine was created somehow by Lenin, it simply has nothing to do with reality, and this is just product of Russian chauvinism, racism, and imperialism. So again, going back to it's the same question of this so-called New Russia is a complete historical myth. The separatism or pro-Russian separatism was never popular throughout eastern and southern Ukraine. It only had something like 30 to 40% support in Crimea, 40% in Crimea, 30% in the Donbass, and therefore not even in those two regions did it have majority support. These regions always had more more of a Ukrainian identity, more of a pro-Ukrainian identity than a pro-Russian. Just because many people spoke Russian language did not make those regions pro-Russian. But that, of course, in the eyes of Moscow, if you are a Russian speaker, you are a compatriot, and therefore you should be pro-Russian, pro-Putin. Ukrainians and Russians are one people. This is a reflection of the revival of pre-Soviet chauvinism and racism towards Ukrainians. It's a rejection of the Soviet concept that Ukrainians are a separate people to Russians, and it brings back to Russia these nationalistic and chauvinistic views which were very dominant in the white Russian emigration in the 1920s and 30s, and of course in the Tsarist Empire as well. The fact that this has nothing to do with reality, again, doesn't really impact upon Russians. They believe this, that somehow Ukrainians and Russians were born together, and they always wanted to be together, and they always will be together. In reality, Ukrainian historians have been writing for over a century, such as Mikhailo Khrushchevsky and others, that Ukrainians had a separate history to Russians, and they were not always, as it were, budding friends, especially dying to reunite or live together. West Ukrainians in particular lived outside of Russian influence right up until World War II. But the idea that Kiev Rus or Kiev in Russia was the first Russian state has been growing in popularity inside Putin's Russia to buttress his claim that Russia has a 1,000-year history of statehood. Of course, this has nothing to do with reality, because Kiev Rus was the birthplace of the Ukrainian people. Most of Kiev Rus was inside the territory of Ukraine, and therefore Ukraine has a right to claim Kiev Rus as the beginning of Ukrainian history, just as Ukrainian historians write that. Russians should focus on cities, maybe part of Kiev Rus, but cities that are today inside Russia, such as Novgorod. As for Moscow, Moscow wasn't founded until 1147, and therefore very late on in Kiev Rus and just on the eve of the Mongol invasion. After Kiev Rus was destroyed by the Mongols in 1240, the legacy of Kiev Rus transfers to the Galician Volhynian kingdom, where it stays until that area, that region, is incorporated inside the Lithuanian and then Lithuanian-Polish Commonwealth. So the legacy of Kiev Rus transfers into Ukrainian history, not into Russian history. But sadly, that Russian imperial approach to Kiev Rus, Kiev Russia, Vladimir Suzdal, Muscovy, Russian Empire, Soviet Union, Russian Federation, is promoted by Russian nationalists, Russian imperialists in Moscow, and it's also promoted by most Western historians of Russia. If you pick up any Western history of Russia, they use this same imperialist nationalist framework for Russian history, denying Ukraine its roots and denying Ukraine a separate history to Russian. In slide 3 of this section, another mythology that Russia has promoted both in 2014 and 2022 is that the Russian speakers in Ukraine are repressed. The problem, of course, is that Putin and his gang of criminals never cite opinion polls in Ukraine to prove that. And all the opinion polls in Ukraine show that most Ukrainians do not see and have never experienced a discrimination or repression of Russian speakers in Ukraine. To promote the Ukrainian language, to improve its status compared to what it used to be like in the Soviet Union, is not has nothing to do with repressing the Russian language. It's just providing support for a language that was previously Russified and looked down upon by the Soviet state. Russian speakers cannot be repressed in Ukraine if we look at the soldiers fighting against Russia in Ukraine, because many of those soldiers are themselves Russian speakers. And if Russian speakers in Ukraine didn't support Ukraine in this war, Ukraine would have been defeated by now. So a lot of this has nothing to do with reality, and especially the claim made on the eve of the full-scale invasion that Ukraine is committing genocide against Russian speakers. That's not true. The only country committing genocide against Russian speakers in Ukraine is Putin's Russia. The Ukrainians who have suffered the most from Putin's Russian criminal bombardments, rapes, torture, and killings have been the Ukrainians who were primarily Russian speakers living in the east and the south of Ukraine. And so again, let's not adopt the dystopian worldview that we have in the Kremlin and Moscow. Linked to this question is that Russian speakers in Ukraine do not translate into them being pro-Putin. That was true in 2014, and that's especially true today. Just because somebody is a Russian speaker does not make them pro-Putin, does not make them less patriotic. We have this in other countries. Majority of people in Ireland, when they go to school, they learn Gaelic, but they primarily use English in Ireland. And that does not make them less patriotic towards Ireland. It's just the question of history. It's also true of Scotland, where most people in Scotland speak English, and true of other countries that also speak the same language as their neighbor. It does not make them less patriotic. In the eyes of Moscow, they cannot fathom, they cannot get their heads around the idea that somehow Russian speakers are pro-Ukrainian. And both 2014 and 2022 show the degree to which absolute majority of Russian speakers in Ukraine were always patriotic Ukrainians. One way to look at this as well is to look at the Azov Battalion, which then became an Azov Regiment. Originally formed in Kharkiv in eastern Ukraine, many of the recruits to the Azov Battalion and Regiment were actually Russian speakers, and they were considered to be one of the best fighting formations in the Ukrainian security and armed forces. Finally, I think another way of looking at this is looking at the Jewish population of Ukraine. The Jewish population of Ukraine, primarily urban and usually therefore Russian-speaking, big heavy concentration in Dnipropetrovsk, now Dnipro, has always been pro-Ukrainian. There's no Soviet nostalgia amongst the Jewish population of Ukraine. And the current president, Volodymyr Zelensky, is of Jewish background, from Dnipropetrovsk, or from the city of Kryvyi Rih in the region of Dnipropetrovsk, and an example of a Ukrainian patriot. Ukrainian Jews have always supported Ukraine fighting against Russia, and many of them are in the Ukrainian armed forces and security forces. In 2014, Jewish Ukrainian oligarch Igor Kolomoisky actually financed volunteer battalions fighting for Ukraine. So again, another example of how Russian speaker does not translate into pro-Putin Russian, despite propaganda coming from Moscow. A fourth myth is this idea that Ukraine is somehow divided, because it's an artificial country, allegedly, divided into a kind of a pro-Russian East and a pro-Western Western part of the country. This has simply always been a myth. Sadly, it's one of the areas that's always been heavily dominant in Western studies of Ukraine, somehow that Ukraine is this artificial combination of two entities, and therefore there was always kind of academic and journalistic kind of claims that Ukraine is a weak state. Ukraine is a state that would easily collapse and disintegrate if it was attacked and invaded. And therefore, many even Western experts, or so-called experts, believed also, like in Moscow, that following a full-scale invasion, that Ukraine would disintegrate into different parts, and that the pro-Russian East would collaborate with the Russian invaders. This was not true. In fact, what happened was Russian-speaking eastern and southern Ukraine moved closer to Western Ukraine and away from Russia, and it also ignores how military aggression changes the dynamic of identity politics and memory politics inside the country. With not only Ukrainians moving away from the Russian language towards Ukrainian, but also Ukrainians self-declaring that they are no longer Russians. Because again, in the East and South, you had quite a high proportion of mixed marriages. And in a mixed marriage, traditionally, those children would say that they were ethnic Russian. They would usually adopt the ethnicity of the father. That swung in a different direction after 2014. It already had begun to some degree before, but recent surveys have shown that the percentage of Ukrainians who regard themselves as ethnic Russian has collapsed. Some polls go as low as 2%, others 4 or 6%. But this is a massive decline compared to the Soviet period, because the last Soviet census was in 1989, where allegedly 22% of Ukraine's population was ethnic Russian. Ukraine held only one census in 2001, and it declined to 17%. So not a great decline, 5%. But today we are talking 4, 5, maybe 6% of the population. So that's from 22% to 6% in just over 3 decades. This makes Ukraine actually one of the most mono-ethnic countries in Europe. So this idea that Ukraine is somehow weak and divided and split is fundamentally wrong. Ukraine is the 4th most nationally homogeneous country in Europe, with 95 or 96% of the population declaring themselves to be ethnic Ukrainian. Fifth myth is this idea that Crimea was always Russian. Again, a commonly held view amongst Western historians of Crimea or Western historians of Russia. This assumes that it's actually a very racist approach to this, to Crimea, because it assumes that the history of Crimea only began when these so-called civilized Russians arrived in 1783. Prior to that, we'll ignore that history. This is simply not true. We would not declare that the history of, shall we say, Australia began in 1770 when Captain Cook arrived, or we wouldn't declare that the history of the United States began with the founding of Jamestown in 1607, or Canada with the founding of Quebec in 1604. There were obviously people already living in those areas, just as there were also people living in Crimea prior to the Russian invasion. And therefore, the history of those territories and of Crimea should be undertaken for a longer period of time. This makes Crimea not always having been Russian, because Crimean history began long before the Russian Empire annexed the place, occupied the peninsula in 1783. It's incredible the degree to which Western historians of Russia and Crimea have actually adopted the Russian imperialist and nationalist framework when writing about Crimea as a kind of a Russian territory, as always having been Russian. If we regard that kind of approach to, say, United States, Canada, or Australia as being racist because it denies the history of the First Nations who lived there before, the native peoples who lived there before, then this is also a racist history when applied to Crimea, because it denies the fact that there were other people other than Russians living in Crimea prior to 1783. Slide 6 talks about the war in Ukraine, both in 2014 and 2022, as some kind of civil war. Putin continues to use this phrase of civil war in Ukraine to claim that he's not actually invading Ukraine, he's supporting one side in the civil war between the good Ukrainians who accept that they are little Russians and should remain under Russian cultural superior leadership, and the bad Ukrainians who are Nazis, who are promoted and financed by the CIA. So this mythical approach to Ukraine of some kind of civil war is a way of denying that Russia is actually fighting a full-scale war against Ukraine, against Ukrainians, irrespective of what language they speak. And it also masks Russia's military support for separatists in 2014, claiming that we had nothing to do with us, these people in the Donbass. They haven't been supported by the Russian military. This wasn't true in 2014, when Russia militarily provided intelligence, training, financial means, and military equipment to separatists, transforming protesters into military insurgents against Ukraine, and then finally invading the Donbass on 24th of August 2014. And then maintaining something like 10,000 Russian occupation troops in those two separatist enclaves, the Donetsk People's Republic and Luhansk People's Republic. Crimea as well, which Russia, of course, invaded and then annexed. But it's a way to hide Russia's military aggression and Russia's invasions. There's never been a civil war in Ukraine. This has always been Russian military aggression, both in 2014, when the first invasion took place, and in 2022, when you had a full-scale invasion. Unfortunately, this mythology of the conflict in Ukraine as a civil war has continued to be promoted, including even by Ukrainian academics in Canada. The chair of Ukrainian studies at the University of Ottawa, headed by Professor Dominique Arel, he and his colleague published a book only a year ago describing the war in Ukraine from 2014 onwards as a civil war. So promoting precisely this Kremlin propaganda. It is incredible not to believe that the Ukrainian diaspora in Canada has allowed Dominique Arel to get away with promoting this Kremlin propaganda without actually taking him on and condemning what he's actually published and writing. The seventh slide is one of the most famous, and it's the idea that Ukraine is run by fascists and neo-Nazis. All this translates into, and it's something that's drawing on Soviet propaganda against Ukrainians. This is drawing on this mythology that Ukraine has two types of Russians, or two types of Ukrainians, I apologize. Good Ukrainians and bad Ukrainians. The good Ukrainians are the ones who accept that they're little Russians, accept that they should be part of the Russian world, that Russians are the elder brother, the leaders of the Eastern Slavs, and accept that Ukraine should look or resemble something like Lukashenko's Belarus. The bad Ukrainians are the fascists, the Nazis, who are paid by the CIA and who want to tear Ukraine away from Mother Russia. So they're fascists and Nazis. The application of these terms, fascist and Nazi or neo-Nazi has nothing to do with political science, has nothing to do with reality. It's all to do with the Soviet legacy, which was very deep in Soviet propaganda. When the Soviet Union attacked diasporas and dissidents, the greatest venom was always against Ukrainians. The Soviet propaganda rarely ever attacked Russian emigres, but Ukrainian diaspora was the most attacked. After the Ukrainian, it was the Estonians, Latvians, and Lithuanians. And they were attacked as kind of collaborators with the Nazis, as being allied to or financed and funded by the CIA and Western intelligence organizations. And they were trying to destroy the Soviet Union, and dissidents inside Ukraine, and dissidents and liberals and opposition leaders were defined as in the pay of the CIA. They were accused of not being truly authentic local people. They were just funded by the West, as it were. So this application of fascist or Nazi, neo-Nazi towards Ukrainians is long-standing in Moscow, and it applies to any Ukrainian of any political persuasion, from left to right, who views Ukrainians as a distinct people to Russians. It's as simple as that. If you view Ukrainians as distinct, if you believe that Ukrainians have a right to their own destiny, right to their own foreign policy, then you are a Nazi and fascist. It's as simple as that. If you don't believe that, then you're a good Ukrainian and you'll probably see yourself as Little Russian. But that's a very small number of people, and hardly any of those still exist. And finally, the idea that somehow Ukraine is not a real country again, it's just a puppet state. Ukraine is a puppet state of the United States, and this draws on both Tsarist and Soviet legacies in the Russian mindset, that Ukrainian identity was always financed by outside powers against Russia, whether it was financed by the Austrians, by the Poles, or by the CIA after World War II, or more recently the European Union. So this Ukrainian identity is fake, it's artificial. This is a puppet state propped up by the West to prevent Russia from reuniting with Ukrainians and to become a more powerful country. Again, it's denying the idea that Ukraine has decided its own future, decided its own destiny. Putin keeps talking about how Zelensky is illegitimate, he shouldn't be the president of Ukraine. It's a strange thing to claim when Russia hasn't had a free election for decades, but there you are. And I don't think Putin's a big expert on elections or democracy. But nevertheless, this idea that Ukraine is somehow a Western puppet state, that the West is controlling Ukraine, the West is in charge of Ukrainian government ministries, Ukrainian military, that Ukrainians can't do anything without an okay from Washington. And this creates problems for Russians trying to understand what's going on in Ukraine, which they obviously find still difficult and problematic. So when Ukrainian secret services organize assassinations of Russian military war criminals, such as just taken place of General Kirillov in Moscow in December of 2024, this is embarrassing for Russia. But they can't get their heads around that these Ukrainians, who supposedly don't exist and supposedly live in a fake state, have been so brazen and so professional in organizing this in the center of Moscow and getting away with it. So what do you have to do? Well, of course it wasn't Ukrainians. Of course it was the British or the Americans who were behind this, really. And this kind of blame game to deflect their inability to understand Ukrainian identity is there all the time. And because it's an unwillingness to accept that the majority of Ukrainians are fighting Russian imperialism, that they've put up this resistance and this long-standing resilience against Russia. It's nothing to do with the West in that sense. The West, yes, can provide military equipment and financial means to help the government budget of Ukraine, but the people on the ground who are doing the grunt work, the military work, the defending work are Ukrainians. And I think it's simply impossible for that Russian mindset to ever accept that. And therefore they have to sort of delve into these fantasy worlds that somehow Ukraine is not a real state, not a fictitious, it's a fictitious state, and the West is propping up this country just to prevent Russia from reviving itself as a great power, because Putin talks about how Ukraine and Russia together would be a powerful entity against the West. As Zbigniew Brzezinski wrote in the 1990s, without Ukraine, Russia doesn't feel it could become a fully fledged empire, and hence this is the complex lying behind here. The very fact that Ukrainians are denying Russians from reviving to be this so-called great power with equality with the United States, as they were when it was the Soviet Union and during the Cold War. And because this denial is taking place, then this has to be done by some kind of conspiracy by the West to prop up this state. In fact, the Ukrainian state has existed for 30 years before this military aggression, or 20 years before this military aggression, is continuing to exist. And it's actually research is showing that Ukrainian economy is in far better shape than the Russian economy. So there's no truth to this myth, just as there's no truth to the previous 7 myths that Russia is propagating. But these are perennially promoted by Russia, and they have a profound impact on the Russian mindset and on the actions of Russian soldiers who are coming to Ukraine to fight fascists or to fight NATO, and to liberate Ukrainians from the travails of living in this Nazi state. None of these have anything to do with reality, and we will finish on that note. We can see that much of this is beyond the imagination of many, I think, people looking at these questions, and often the response is, do they really believe all this? Is it really possible? I'm afraid that in Moscow and the majority of the Russian population do buy into these views. And sadly, that's the reason why so many Russians are willing to die. This is very different from the 1980s, when most Russians were unwilling to die for the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. Today, Russians don't seem to have a problem dying for these myths which they believe to be truths, at a rate of 2,000 casualties a day. Yes, many of these myths are dystopian, are strange, are bizarre, are weird. And we do wonder, do they really believe these? But they do. They believe them, and it proves to what degree Ukrainians and Russians have become very different. They already were becoming very different right from the late 1980s till 2013. But since 2014, there's now a chasm, a gulf, which is so wide it will not be breached for decades to come between Ukrainians and Russians. Thank you.